You may have heard of niche modeling, of course. A lot of you mentioned it. A lot of you are experts in it. Some of you just use output from niche models as ingredients in your analyses. So hopefully this is useful for everyone. This is one of the earliest examples I know of kind of niche modeling. Right? So this is a really hard to read map, but this is work from Australia in 1924. And if you can read that and you know your Australian geography really well, that's the east coast of Australia. Brisbane is here, Hunter River is down there. And so what Johnson was interested in was predicting the spread of prickly pear in Australia. So he took some maps of precip and temperature, really coarsely drawn things, and kind of took a crayon and said, oh, right about here is where this species should be able to invade, and that's the red line. And the shading there is where the species actually was. So he did a pretty good job just kind of doing, hand drawings. So we haven't actually gone that much further. We just use statistical algorithms now to do that model fitting. And so the process overall is, right, we start with some occurrence data. This is our friend eastern hemlock. And we have some predictor variables. These are both in geographic space. Those are our inputs. And we want to model the species occurrence data as a function of these environmental covariates. Lots of ways to do that. Right? And so these are our modeled response functions. So we fit a statistical model using these two data types. And again, there's, probably a dozen or more different ways that people actually do this statistical modeling. But this is an empirical model, right? There's no mechanism here. It's just curve fitting. And that all goes on in environmental space. So we start in geographic space. We do the modeling actually in environmental space. We often ignore the spatial structure and things like that when we do that. And then we project this model back to geographic space and we map distribution of the species, habitat suitability, that sort of thing. It's often at this stage that we might do some model evaluation. We do that in geographic space as well. And then, right, we're interested in range shifts here, so we're going to then project this model to future climate scenarios and say, oh, this is where the species might occur on the landscape in the future. And for hemlock, we already know that this is a lie because hemlock woolly adelgid is going to wipe out this species before it really ever gets a chance to do too much range shifting, probably. All right, so what goes in, right? Normally, it's something like presence-absence data, presence-only data, or abundance. Then we have our environmental covariates. Most often it's climate or bioclimatic variables. We might use soil, topography, vegetation, et cetera. And sometimes occurrence of other species if we want to try to model interactions. But normally that's just between kind of like a plant and a pollinator, really strong interaction is where that's been done most often. And so what comes out? Well, it depends on the type of occurrence data, the statistical model, your interpretation. But typically, it's maps of probability of presence if you're working with presence-absence data. If you're working with presence-only data, typically that's habitat suitability or quality or relative habitat suitability. If you're putting in abundance data, you get abundance predictions out. Some people interpret this as potentially occupied habitat. Other people call that the species distribution. Some say it's a geographic projection of the ecological niche. And we can debate that if you'd like at some point. Or I'll just leave, whatever. Okay, assumptions and limitations. There's lots. The ones that are most relevant probably here is this idea that species are at equilibrium with the environment. So another way of saying that is that the geographic distribution is constrained by the environmental factors alone. I'm talking abiotic factors here. And its current distribution represents the entire range of environments the species can tolerate. And, of course, we hope that the relevant covariates are included in the model that do this. Who knows? Maybe they just happen to be correlated by chance. And then when we project these models in space or time, we're assuming something called niche conservatism, which is a big underlying assumption in these models. So the niche concept, of course, plays really large in niche modeling. And people have written at length about different aspects of the niche and, what have you, but I think it's easier, or the easiest to think about this in terms of Hutchinson's fundamental and realized niches, right? So you probably remember that the fundamental niche is this n-dimensional hypervolume, every point that corresponds to an environment that would permit the species to exist, And then there's the realized niche is the subset of that environment where the species actually exist due to interacting with other species, dispersal limitations, et cetera. And of course, we could have occurrences outside of these places if it's a sink habitat, right? You have lots of propagules, but they can't actually survive or reproduce there, but we might observe them there occasionally. That's problematic. So if we go back to geographic space and we think about, we've studied this species really well, so we know its fundamental niche, and so we can map all of the environments it could occur in if it was, the only organism on the planet and didn't need any other organisms to interact with. And then we can start chipping away at this, right? We might remove these islands because of dispersal limitation. Maybe this is a salamander and it can't or hasn't crossed saltwater, disturbance, et cetera, biotic interactions and land use, whatever, chops down the fundamental niche to the realized distribution here. And so then when we go out and sample, we're really happy because, look, we did this great job of sampling here, and so we really know this species niche. But we're just sampling a subset of the environments where it could actually occur. So there's lots of reasons why this relationship might not hold into the future. We could have interactions with other species that could expand or otherwise change this relationship. Dispersal can influence these relationships as well. We can have adaptation that can expand the niche, realized niche or fundamental niche. And one that's maybe not as well appreciated by people so much is this idea that, if this blue square is the full range of environments that currently exist, in the future, some of these might disappear and new ones might arise, and we have no information about how the species is going to perform in those new spaces. Right, so the key assumption here is that what we observe at present is going to hold into the future in terms of these relationships. And there's evidence that that's not always the case. So this is some work out of Jack's lab here. This is Fraxinus plotting the niche in environmental space here. You can see 15,000 years ago, abundance was relatively high in this region, and then moving forward in time, it expanded out into these other regions. And we also see changes in niche overlap through time. So that's an example of the niche changing in response to climate change and all the other things that go along with it. We also see these during biological invasions when a species is introduced from its native range, niche shown here, and invades a new place, the niche can shift to new climate spaces that it doesn't occur in. And I think that these kinds of things are probably rare overall, but they do occur. And so it's important when we're using these models to think about that, especially when we're projecting them to completely novel contexts like what we're thinking about here. So how much time I have? 6 minutes. Okay, and so one final thing is, kind of harping on this idea that, what we're really predicting often is a potential distribution, not the actual distribution of the species. So if this is the current prediction and we project that into the future and go, oh, look, this is where it's going to be, right? The extent to which that actually happens is a function of demographic and dispersal processes. And so if you're something like a salamander, your range might end up just being this overlap for a long period of time. Or if you're a tree, it could take decades or centuries to realize this. So if we're thinking about modeling range shifts with niche models, we're really just saying, oh, this is where kind of this broad climate envelope is going to move. The extent to which the species actually gets there is a function of a whole lot of really complicated processes that are a lot harder to measure. Okay, so just to kind of review these, these niche models treat realized niches like fundamental niches. They assume distributions reflect the entire range of conditions the species can tolerate. They ignore the host of other factors determining range limits, especially other species, and they ignore range dynamics like demography and dispersal. They assume that all individuals or populations or life stages respond in a similar fashion to the environment. So you could think of like the regeneration niche for trees is very different from the climate that adult trees can tolerate and reproduce in, that kind of thing. And keep in mind that populations respond to environmental change, not species, but we're modeling often at the species level. I mentioned this earlier, presence infers suitable habitat, so we're ignoring sink habitats. They're correlative, right? So we all know the dangers of doing that. Doesn't often stop us. And then there's all these things about like data quality, spatial sampling bias, spatial autocorrelation, correlated variables, spatial scale, all of these things that, again, are important, but not always easy to deal with. So the other thing that Sean wanted me to talk about was kind of frontiers. And so I'm going to focus on what I see as the frontiers are kind of tackling these two areas, trying to get other species into these models a little bit. I'm not going to talk about range dynamics, like incorporating demography and dispersal, because I think the next talk by Britta is going to tackle that. And then some modeling work on intraspecific variation. Right, okay, so these are the frontiers as I see them. Joint species distribution modeling, I heard several of you mention that, so that's cool. Community level modeling. These are actually, I see as different things, but I group them together. Incorporating adaptation, interspecific variation, traits into these models, and again, the last one I'm not going to deal with. So the joint distribution community level modeling version of this, right? So this is modeling a species by itself in isolation of everything else around it in terms of other organisms, right? We have our occurrence data, we have our environmental covariates. But then we go outside and we go, hey, look, you know, this species is growing in a community. It's interacting with other members of that community. If some were to die out, abundances would shift in response to that, even if climate was held constant. And so these models attempt to model assemblage level data. So now we're putting multiple species on this side of the equation. And so, you know, like a joint SDM framework might model these conditional on the presence or abundance of other species. A community level model might model this matrix in a number of different ways, looking at kind of overall response functions at the community level, that sort of thing. And so what you get out of some of these models are cool things like this. So this is a residual correlation matrix that comes out of these some of these joint distribution models. And the red are negative correlations and the blue are positive correlations. So blue are species that tend to co-occur together more than you'd expect by chance. And the red are species that tend to not co-occur together more than you'd expect by chance. So there's potentially something going on there. You know, I think the desire is often to interpret this as biotic interactions, but that might be taking it too far without further work. And as I mentioned in my introduction, we've done some work with the community level models using pollen data and projecting these models forward in time and back in time, and then using pollen data at those times to evaluate these models. And we compared those to SDMs. And what we find is that the SDMs tend to do better than the community level when they're fit and projected to times close together, right? Once you start extrapolating further out, we start seeing the CLMs doing better than the SDMs. And especially when we're projecting from like data poor times in the Pleistocene and forward, the CLMs tend to outperform the SDMs, perhaps because they're incorporating this additional information that you get from co-occurrence patterns. 1 minute. Okay, I'm almost done. Incorporating adaptation, intraspecific variation traits. There's lots of stuff going on here right now. One of the more common approaches, and there was a reading on this sort of approach, is instead of modeling species overall, we're modeling populations within species. And so you're just, in essence, fitting niche models to these individual populations. I like this approach, but it can become data constrained because you're now chopping up a larger pool of data into a smaller pool. So that can be problematic. And then this is a paper, Ecology Letters, where they're modeling these populations through time and trying to predict current genetic structure by simulating dispersal and movement of individual genetic clusters. This is some of my work on using genomic data to model, in essence, a continuous way of modeling populations. And so here we get these turnover functions from these models that are changes in allele frequency as a function of different environmental gradients. The red curves here are SNPs within a gene that control phenology, and the black one are just neutral, they're considered neutral. And so we see these ostensibly adaptive SNPs showing these really prominent response to the environment, which we can then project across space and make some inferences about where might populations be least able to respond to climate in the future. But again, this is curve fitting, and these sorts of maps really need to be tested in some way. And so hopefully future work will be able to do some of that. And I think that's it for me. So thanks.
Hello, thanks for the talk. So do you have some summary data that will show how robust the first assumption is, the realized and fundamental niche being nearly the same?
In terms of like niche conservatism through time, or?
In terms of just how much you can actually predict, you know, is it like you get 80% of the distribution right? 50, 95?
Oh, yeah. Well, I guess the only example I know where they've tried to test that is where they've compared models for crops that are supposedly more of like a mechanistic fundamental niche approach, where they know the climatic tolerances really well, and then compared those to niche models. But for most species that are poorly studied, I don't think we would know without doing a lot of physiological experiments. Yeah. Hargrave's paper.
Sorry to follow up, but there's a Hargraves et al. Paper in American Naturalist in 2014, which is a meta-analysis of studies that look at the population growth rate of transplant experiments. And so they look at the actual range limit of a species, and then they measure the population growth rate of the species inside and out of that. And so, yeah, and I think what they find is lots of times there's a relationship. Surprise, surprise, it's not perfect. It's like, I forget, it's like 50 to 75% of the variability you can explain. So like yeah, I think that's what I remember. It's a great study. I've had nothing to do with it, but it's totally worth looking up. It's a nice one.
The one it's Hymans and Graham, but I could find the year for you. Yeah. Joe?
This kind of thing, I think it's really important to incorporate biotic practices to look at co-occurring sort of species distributions, in particularly with phenology, right? Is that the new data is saying that the microbial community can actually determine when a plant breaks bud or when a plant flowers. And so what's actually being signaled is the microbial community, and it's saying, it's warm enough, you can break bud now. And so these models where you're projecting, and I'm not saying you project, models that project sort of patterns of phenology without considering the mechanism behind it, maybe missing it. You know, if the groups aren't shifting at the same time, then what you predict based upon phenology could be completely wrong.
I think that's one of the kind of the attraction and downfall, right? The attraction of niche models is their simplicity, right? It's the kind of data we have in most, greatest frequency, et cetera. But the lack of all this biological realism is sort of the Achilles heel. And so the question is, like, how much realism do we put in, and can we put in?
I have a quick question. You showed that the community level modeling showed an improvement when you're looking at longer time scales and outside your frame of reference. What's the source of that improvement? Is it because there's more power? Is it because the community level modeling gets over some of those assumptions that you talked about? What's the main advantages?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that we know for sure. I think, in the paper we argued that you're kind of borrowing strength across species. So you're finding these kind of common responses across multiple species. The community level models do worse for the current time, right? So, SDMs seem like, okay, they're doing really good now, but when you project them, they're not doing as well. The CLMs aren't doing as well now, but seem to do better when you project them. But yeah, exactly why that is, requires more thought and work, I'd say.
I've got the microphone, so I'm going to jump in. I've been critical of species distribution models for a long time, but not for the reasons that you you said, and you make me a little bit want to defend them. I want to point out a couple of things. So first of all, you could sort of argue that Hutchinson was kind of making the opposite point, that you could know a whole lot about physiology, what we've called process, sort of physiological detail, demographic rates, and you wouldn't be able to predict species distribution and abundance. So he was kind of making that point, and it's a very common phenomenon in statistics. It's called Simpson's paradox. It's called the ecological fallacy. It's the fact that you want on the left-hand side of the equation everything that's responding, and once you do that, in this case it would be the community. So the observation is not an individual species. We've heard a lot about models where you put a bunch of species in, but they're not on the left-hand side. And so the term that statisticians would use for this is a generative model. In other words, you've got something you want to predict, it's a whole community, and if it's generative, you should be able to use the fitted model to predict the data that went into it. And so I'll just say that, for joint species distribution models, that's what they do if they're set up properly, and it doesn't really have to do with how mechanistic they are. You can put size distributions, you can put dynamics on the left-hand side. It gets to a bigger model, but it's trying to address this issue that you're predicting at the scale you're fitting, and that's what species distribution models really miss. You miss the fact that you've got a coupling of species that are jointly responding. So anyway, I enjoyed the talk with a few additional thoughts.
So I have a comment and a question. The first is comment about, I think you did a great job in terms of summarizing some of the issues, but I think what is missing in general in the field is to assess how much does that have an impact on the actual predictions. So we know these models, with all their caveats, have been able to successfully predict invasions, and I know it's on a short time scale, but we know they work even though they have a lot of these unrealistic assumptions. So I think what is needed is really work that actually explore when they break up. And kind of what you show in short time intervals is they work. When is the point when we really cannot rely on these models anymore? Yeah. That's work that's needed. But in terms of the question is, these community level models, if I remember correctly from your paper, they still did a fairly poor job over long time scales. And I think the reason is you're introducing now a new assumption, that is that the interactions between a species, that each conservative, in terms of interaction, holds for the community, which we know from what just Mike presented and some of the work with the pollen data, the species respond uniquely. Yeah. They don't respond as a community. So how much of a risk is going to involve making these community-level models for long extensions of time?
Right. So you're right. That the figure I didn't show from the paper is that once you start projecting to climates very different from that in which the models were fit, you don't do much better than random with either model. So that's disturbing. And then the second question is, so these community-level models don't assume communities are marching across the landscape. They do allow flexible, individualistic responses. It's just that those responses are kind of more averaged across the community as a whole rather than having these highly individualistic responses to climate. So there's sort of a balance between the one extreme of totally individualistic responses at the species distribution modeling side, and the other end, which we know is unrealistic, is that there's community types that just march across the landscape. So they're sort of in the middle.